Good afternoon, my name's Natasha Johnston and we're joining you today from JCP Solicitors. We've been asked to answer some questions by the organisation For Cardiff. I'm joined today by my colleague Lucy.
Hello, my name's Lucy Miles and I work alongside Natasha in the HR Services team. So we outsource HR to the clients of the business.
Great, so the way we're going to look at running today is Lucy's going to ask me the questions you've asked and I'm going to respond with some advice for you. So over to Lucy.
Yeah. Okay, so the first question, how do I pay staff who are off work due to school closures?
Okay, so it's a really important question as you know a lot of working families will be affected by these changes, particularly those that aren't in key workers and therefore don't have childcare at this point in time. So the first thing we would encourage employers to do would be to look for flexible working opportunities or home working opportunities for their staff if possible. If, however, you cannot offer these arrangements to your staff, they are entitled to reasonable unpaid time off to look after their children, either through parental leave or the right to time off for dependents. However, we would stress if you have got a policy provision where you offer paid special leave for these types of situations, that would still apply. Okay.
So another good question then, when do I have to pay staff who are self-isolating?
Okay, so this has brought up a lot of confusion because there's the requirement to self-isolate when you have symptoms, and then there's also the guidance around social distancing for those in vulnerable groups. So those in vulnerable groups would be those who have a pre-existing medical condition or are advised to have the flu jab, the over 70s, and those with suppressed immune systems and pregnant women. If staff are taking time off to self-isolate because either they have symptoms or a member of their family has symptoms, they are entitled to statutory sick pay from day one of the absence, and that's payable for 14 days. If, however, you have staff who do not want to come to work because they fit into a vulnerable category and they are concerned about contracting the virus through socialisation and contact, they are not entitled to paid time off if they do not want to come to work.
Okay, so the next question is, if my staff are on 0-hour or temporary contracts, what is my obligation with sick pay?
Okay, so those staff that are on temporary contracts or 0-hour contracts, unfortunately a lot will come down to how often they're working for you and what you've obligated to pay in the contract. So it's really important you have a look at that and ensure you know what your obligations are. Most workers are entitled to statutory sick pay if they are self-isolating.
Okay, so another school-based question then. So when the schools close and parents have to work from home, what are my obligations to pay them if they need to be home to care for their children?
Again, really important question, and it's really important to stress, we really are in unprecedented times, in uncharted water, and we're going to need our staff to bounce back at the end of this period of time. So trusting them to work from home, encouraging them to adopt how they work, if they can work earlier in the morning, later in the evening, so they can be at home with their children. Please try and do it, but again, it's really important that if they are working, you continue to pay them as usual, or if they are taking time off, that's either parental leave, unpaid leave, or possibly letting them use some annual leave.
Okay, so you just spoke about trust then, so one of the questions then is, how can I monitor that my staff are working when they say they are?
Okay, so with these guidelines we have to be sensible. We're not able to drive around and have as much freedom as we usually would. Some of the things we have recommended to our clients this week would be to use Skype, to use video conferencing, telephone calls. Staff can email one another and let them know what they're doing. And I think whilst we would hope that we can be as efficient and as possible during these times, it may be the case that employers do perhaps need to show a little bit of flexibility and expect perhaps that we're not going to be as efficient as we usually are.
Okay. So an employer's asked, if staff fall into the high risk categories, what obligations do I have to protect them as an employee?
Okay, so again, really important. And as we said, at this point in time, there's no guidance from the government that these people cannot attend work. They are being encouraged to socially distance themselves as much as possible when they're not working, but certainly some things you could be looking at would be modifying, their working pattern, so allowing them to come into work during less peak times, so they're not interacting with as many people as they're coming in and out of the office, letting them work, in isolation if you can put them into a separate office, and if that's not possible, trying to space out desks so that everybody does have, 2 meters around them really.
Okay, so just like linking into that question then, is there any general advice in supporting vulnerable staff without that being seen in detriment to the general staff with no issues?
Everything here, it needs to be on a case-by-case basis, taken into account, the circumstances of that individual. Obviously, if somebody is in one of those vulnerable groups, they could be considered to have disability. There may be considerations with the Equality Act, and you've then got a duty, to consider reasonable adjustments for that person. But it's just about, making sure as much as possible you really are, looking after your staff, letting them be flexible, listening to their concerns, and just working with them individually to come up with tailored plans. If you really are at a point where you're concerned or you don't know where to go to, it may be helpful to utilise occupational health for some advice on specific health conditions to make sure that any interventions you're putting in place are appropriate for that person's condition.
Okay, so we've had a question regarding employment contracts. So an employer's asked, do people need to have a change in their employment contract to reflect change in SSP, so statutory sick pay?
So at the moment, there have been some changes to the rules around statutory sick pay, and that is that if anybody is self-isolating, they are entitled to statutory sick pay from day 1 of their absence, which differs to the usual statutory sick pay provisions where you have 3 unpaid days and then the SSP rate kicks in from day 4. There's no need to change employment contracts at this point in time in relation to this change. And if there comes a point where we did need to change contracts, you'd be looking at that at a much later point in time when things are more established.
Okay, so also talking about contracts then, employers asked, are they able to change contracts to 0 hours without telling the employees then? And also then would they have to pay you then? Okay,
so another important question, because like a lot of companies who are in perhaps industries that have really been affected, the hospitality sector, pubs, clubs, restaurants, cinemas and all that sort of thing, there isn't enough work at the moment, possibly because people aren't coming, and using your facilities. You cannot just change your staff's contractual working hours, without consultation. And if you were facing a point whereby you needed to seriously look at reducing your staff's working hours, we would really encourage you to obtain some HR advice in the process you need to go about to do that, legally.
Okay, so some employees may be concerned then how they're going to contact their employees whilst they're working at home. So is there any advice you can give them? What's the best ways to actually contact their staff then?
Okay. So one of the first things that employers need to look at doing is making sure they have up-to-date personal contact details for all their staff. So sending an email round if you use a HR portal or a local system. Make sure that your staff are updating their contact details, and perhaps if you're all going to be working remotely now, giving those details out to line managers or colleagues when perhaps they don't usually have personal numbers. And as well, we've got to weigh up that staff are in their homes, they're perhaps not going to be working all of the time, so agree, acceptable times when you should be getting in touch and when you shouldn't be getting in touch. So perhaps, first thing in the morning or a bit later in the evening, but, we'd encourage you not just to be ringing staff, as and when, try and have some sort of structure around when staff can expect to hear from you.
Okay, so another question asked is, we use Sage Payroll. Will the system automatically recognise the new directive that SSP can be paid from day 1 on self-certification?
So I don't work at Sage, so I don't know the answer from Sage's perspective, but what I would anticipate is that a lot of software companies, for payroll perhaps haven't been able to put updates in just yet. So you need to be contacting any payroll providers and checking that what their regulations or rules are around informing them staff are self-isolating, so that they can pay the self-isolation statutory sick pay rules rather than sick pay for other periods of absence.
Okay, so on to the final question now. An employee has asked me about their rights in relation to coming into work, as there are a lot of people in the organisation and they don't want to risk infection and passing it on to their vulnerable family members at home. What would your advice be?
So if that person is just concerned and is looking at those social distancing measures. As we touched upon earlier, they don't automatically have a right to statutory sick pay if they do not want to come to work. So some of the things we would suggest, and I think has been quite a theme throughout this chat really, is look at home working, look at modifying their workstation. Can they work in an office by themselves? Can you alter their working hours so that they're not coming into contact with as many people? And the other point I'd perhaps pick up on with that person is quite clearly, they're very stressed and anxious, and so make sure you're giving them support for their mental well-being and signposting them to appropriate organisations or the HR team for further support.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. So that brings us to the end of the questions. Just a reminder that this advice was given on Friday the 20th of March at 12:15. If you'd like to get in contact with us, please visit our website. So it's jcpsolicitors.co.uk. We'd just like to tell everyone to stay safe, and thank you for listening.